Hello, welcome. I'm very pleased to welcome you today to the RG Check information session. Thank you so much for joining what we hope will be a very informative and practical session for those of you interested in iGaming accreditation. My name is Tracy Parker, and I'm the Director of Standards and Accreditation here at the Responsible Gambling Council, and I'm very pleased today to be joined by my colleague Bob Michniak, who is the Senior Manager of RG Check Accreditation. I know that I'm waiting for my slides to come up. I know, but I will speak now to our work at the Responsible Gambling Council. I know that many of you are familiar with all the work that we do at RGC, whether it's you've been working with others in terms of Play Smart centers, training programs, research, community programs, prevention education, and even I know some of you are involved with RG Check for your land-based venues. And so all of those pieces work together to in RGC's mission to work with all stakeholders across the board. So a very comprehensive approach to our mission in terms of prevention and mitigation of the harms associated with problem gambling. RG Check accreditation in particularly is what we're going to spend the next 30 or 40 minutes talking with you about today. We've left about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the program to speak to you specifically in regards to some questions you may have. So please start taking notes there. You can put those into the chat and we'll see those at the end. I know that some of you indicated questions in the when you registered, and certainly we've organize the information to try to answer as many of those as possible. But if we don't, of course, ask those through the chat and at the Q&A. And obviously reach out at any point in time if you need some particular specific information that might be unique to your operations. We're happy to answer those directly after the session. And as well, if you've asked questions that don't get answered, or if what we speak to and present to you raises more questions, of course, we're happy to answer those either in the Q&A or after the session in particular. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk to you in a little bit more detail about the framework and structure of the RG Check accreditation, specifically in terms of the scoring approach that we use as well. And then my colleague Bob is going to walk through a very practical step-by-step approach to the accreditation process itself. And of course, throughout this process, we'll be looking to explain to you and highlight some of the benefits of RG Check accreditation. RG Check accreditation works best when it is considered holistically as part of an organization's broader approach to risk management, audit, compliance. RG Check really is that sort of strong third-party independent piece of that whole sort of framework and system. And there's obviously a strong communications element to an RG Check accreditation program, and whether that's using the process or the final report to educate and inform frontline employees, senior management employees, board of directors, and also using accreditation to facilitate conversations with external stakeholders. And of course, there's pieces in responsible gambling that throughout the process in working with the team and in the final report that will contribute to an ongoing approach to continuous improvement, and a source of information and feedback that's research-based and evidence-informed. So and we're really able to deliver all of those benefits given our strong approach to accreditation, our systematic approach. RG Check is a very trusted and well-respected accreditation program that's collaborative and relevant. We've been doing this work for over a decade around the world, and are quite focused in work, as I mentioned, in terms of all aspects of responsible gambling, as you'll see as we get into more details in terms of the framework and structure. While some of you I know are familiar with the land-based accreditation, what we hope to do today is focus more specifically on online accreditation. And with that, we'll look in more detail at the specific standard areas. So as you can see that there's a lot of alignment between our approach with venues and with iGaming. And it's also, you'll be interested to note for those that haven't done the venue piece, that obviously there's a strong approach and a strong focus on the core aspects, things that you'd expect to see in terms of strategy, self-exclusion, player education, informed decision-making, those sort of core RG program pieces. But we also take a very holistic approach in terms of how RG is integrated throughout the organization. So looking around things around marketing, advertising, accounts, product design, those pieces, give us a really good indication of the commitments and intentions, and then look down into how RG is actually being integrated and playing out for players and employees across the organization. I'd also like to point out a new standard area for iGaming in the last one there in terms of stakeholder engagement. And so many of the requirements for stakeholder engagement for iGaming are integrated throughout the venue standards and criteria, though given sort of the virtual nature, the online nature of online, we've extracted that for the iGaming accreditation specifically, and we look at the overall approach, around inclusivity, around materiality, and look at interaction with some specific stakeholder groups in terms of players, community engagement, community agencies, researchers, those kinds of groups, to see how the program is collaborative and integrated throughout. And then here you can see sort of the framework that the RG Check accreditations applies. I know some of you are familiar with the standards and criteria, and they're certainly posted on the RG Check website. And as you've seen, there are 9 standard areas for the iGaming accreditation. Each of those standards have multiple criteria that are applied to them. And so for iGaming, there's 48 criteria that are part of those 9 standard areas. And the indicators and evidence